Hello, in this video I want to, well it sort of connects with all the other videos I do, but I'm going to have a look at Pythagoras and Pythagorean and music theory, which essentially developed from the Pythagorean schools. And towards the end we're going to look into something else. Now there is geometry in the humming of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. Now by spheres I mean planets, and we're going to look at how this connects to how the music theory actually also connects to an interesting, lovely connection to astronomy, something that's very controversial among certain circles. But to begin with, we have the seven liberal arts, and most important amongst them, we have the quadrivium: astronomy, geometry, and we'll see in a second, arithmetic and music, and how these things blend together, how these separate disciplines are all interconnected, and through the liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, how it's actually a wonderful way, I think, of teaching this particular method, but how they connect to so many other aspects. And first, let's consider music and music theory, and then ask the question, what the hell does that have to do with blacksmiths and hammers? And well, alright, let this little portion run first, and then we'll have an example. So for blacksmiths beating, working there with their hammers, what has that got to do with Pythagoras and music theory? Well, as according to the legend, it was actually developed because of this, and that has what's called the Pythagorean hammers. So Pythagoras was walking along, he heard this harmony. Where does it come from? Well, he walking past a blacksmith shop, and he went inside to investigate, and he noticed that the blacksmiths were hammering away, and that each one had a slightly different hammer. Now, that clip's not the best example because the hammers are not necessarily the same as was witnessed by Pythagoras, but this concept of music and the hammers carries through, well, in writings and in depictions, and especially connected to, well, weights and measures is very important in this, but even like through the Middle Ages up through to the Renaissance. And this is a very interesting, important picture because it shows Pythagorean music, and well, some other elements. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But Pythagoras of Samos, famous for being one of the so-called first mathematician. Pythagoreans swore an oath on the Tetractys. The Tetractys is a famous element from ancient Greece, and for instance, so this picture is from, well, the Theory of Music, 1942, 1492. So this goes back quite some time, and very interesting little details in regards to that. So there we see bottom left-hand corner the strings, bottom right-hand corner we see them playing on the pipes. Top right-hand corner, we see, well, bells, or you could even do it with glass and glass, glass, different levels of liquid inside it. Same way that you see those people, ringing the glass, those music players. But do we see the hammers there? So what do hammers have to do with this particular thing? Well, first, if we examine, if you pay attention to the glasses and to the bells, we'll see those numbers, like for instance, 16, 12, etc., going down. Like now, as we move to the next picture, we see the pipes, and again, if you pay attention, you'll see those numbers attached to the pipes and how they're set at a certain proportion, which brings us back to this Pythagorean music theory, which it's embedded still in to this day. It's at the core of music. And also one of the pictures showed the strings, and we see how the strings are weighted: 16, 12, 9, 8, 6, 4, and this set of proportions. Which brings us back to the most important picture, is the hammers there. And again, if you look closely at the hammers, you'll see that the numbers are written on those hammers, because when Pythagoras entered, as according to the legend, when he entered the blacksmith shop, he noticed that because they were each of the hammers was at a set scale of weight, so 12 pounds, 9 pounds, 8 pounds, 6 pounds. So that's where the harmony of the sound come from, and that's where still to this day modern music theory is based in this. This is not, again, this is sort of 101. You can just Google it. It's there. It's not really disputed at all. I wish I could find a better clip to show, because if those hammers were properly scaled, but for instance, we come back to the tetractys and we see the ratio between these hammers. So we have 4 to 3, the fourth, and again how it connects to the tetractys. And then now we have a 3 to 2 scaling, which is the perfect fifth as it's called. And again, through the scaling of the hammers, and eventually that brings us to another little relevant point. And again, this is sort of like standard music theory. This is not some way out there thing at all. And we have the whole tone. There's a lot of literature in regards to this. Again, you can just Google search. Like I don't. I sort of encourage everyone to investigate this more for themselves. Every time I do a video, I'm really just skimming the surface. There's so much depth to it, and again, it carries on. So there we have music and how it come from these ancient schools and then carried through, especially through the Hermeticists. Of course, it was even older than that. The great cathedrals, you'll find the same things going on now. I wish there was a better example which give the audio. So if the hammers were tuned, the audio would be a better demonstration. But just as an example. But how does this music compare to astronomy? Well, first let's do a quick little review.
Watch. First, we'll need a string. Stretch it good and tight. Plunk it. Now divide in half. Plunk again. You see? It's the same tone, 1 octave higher. Now divide the next section. And the next. Pythagoras discovered the octave had a ratio of 2 to 1. With simple fractions, he got this. And from this harmony in numbers developed the musical scale of today.
By God, you do find mathematics in a gorgeous place.
So we saw the scale of 1 to 2, just by halving the string and then by halving it again. Well, if we go in reverse and say if we doubled and then doubled and then doubled, what do we have? Well, we're going to come to something very interesting. As again, something that's quite controversial. There's a lot of let's just call it, hate around it, and because it really flies in the face of the acceptable schools of thought in regards to some things, and that's Bode's law, has it so called. It was actually developed by Titius, and it has to do with connections with geometry, the same rules which are applying to music, and how that applies to the distance between the planets of our solar system. So here's a little quick example, and so we can see on the left hand side we begin with a circle, then we have the triangle, the hexagon, the 12-sided, 24, 48, etc. with a very simple rule of +4, then divide it by 10, and how those, so 3, 6, 12, 24, 48, etc.
Now divide in half. Plunk again. You see? It's the same tone, 1 octave higher. Now divide the next section. And the next.
So these particular sets of numbers ad infinitum are shown in major cathedrals, public buildings, not cherry-pick some little random supermarket until I found the right measures. I mean the US Capitol building, White House, grand cathedrals, major public buildings, ones which are which were competitions, and a lot of money went into it. They're at the heart of power, and we have the same sets of numbers. It always comes back to these, and this describes Bode's law. Now, for instance, we begin with a circle. From that, we +4 over 10, and which gives us 0.4. The distance of Mercury from the Sun is smack bang right in the middle of where it would be predicted by Bode's law. And what's interesting is that Bode's law not only showed where planets were, and so that might be one thing, but it actually predicted where other planets, unknown planets, would be. Now, one exception to Bode's law is Venus, but remember that Venus rotates in the opposite direction of every other single planet. The consensus is that there was some sort of impact or something happened to Venus, because the standard model of the creation, the accretion model, they all orbit in the same direction. They should all rotate, spin in the same direction, except for Venus. And again, the consensus is that something happened, because otherwise the existing model doesn't work. Now we have 6, so Venus was 3 plus 4 over 10. Now we double that. Now this is all built around the vesica geometry. You draw a circle, we have Mercury, and you draw a second circle of the vesica, you get the equilateral triangle. And as you keep building, you get the hexagon, then you get the 12-pointed star, Mars, 12 plus 4 over 10. Smack bang, just like it predicts where Mars should be. Now, at the time that this was devised on Ceres, now Ceres is one part of the asteroid belt. It's a body of planets, of protoplanets, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And but it actually predicted where Ceres would be, and again, this is extraordinary. It predicted where. So it's one thing to map existing ones, but again, this predicted where other planets would be. Now Jupiter was known, and again, it works. It's spot on. Again, right in that chunky part, and the excuse used to debunk Bode's law, because it's predicting something. It's not just finding a pattern that fits what's known. It's predicting. And so when the early periodic table was done, he worked exactly the same. He predicted elements which didn't exist, and then they come to pass. Now this is accepted as an extraordinary piece of information, of knowledge. But Bode's law, which again predicts where Saturn should be, and well, again, then what did they find? And then Uranus. Where's Uranus? It's exactly where Bode's law depicted it. Now we come to Neptune, and now Bode's law does not work on Neptune, but in a very similar way it does not work in Venus. But just like Venus is extraordinary in comparison to the other ones, well, so is Neptune, because Neptune, for a portion of its orbit, Neptune is further away from the Sun than what is Pluto. Neptune is effectively in the Kuiper belt, and so that would make, again, just like Venus, the exception of Venus and the exception of Neptune can, I think there's a reasonable way to consider it, and that's because, well, yeah, it's in the Kuiper belt. Pluto is sometimes closer, so there's a good reason to consider that, yeah, just as Venus is exceptional, so is Neptune. As a sample in regards to the attitude in regards to Bode's law, or the well, it's interesting. So, for instance, it's just a short example of the let's say the mentality which opposes it. So, for instance, they point out that the irregularity, how it comes. Well, the spanner in the works comes with the discovery of Neptune. Now, Neptune, like for instance, okay, Pluto's no longer considered a planet. It's part of a Kuiper belt, but for a significant part of its orbit, Pluto is actually closer than Neptune. So Neptune is being interfered with in a way. So like Neptune in itself is a special case. But there is this other, where they reference this paper and how people are trying to use it, and in regards to exoplanets, so solar systems other than ours, and there has been a movement recently to at least try and consider it and maybe use it as a way of predicting planets in the Goldilocks zone. And because we don't have a good picture of the planets and the solar systems out there, so it's a little bit up in the air. It's by no means confirmed. However, if we go to well, for instance, the comments I think are very telling. I'll be very cautious relying on dubious predictions of Titius Bode law, there are professional peer-reviewed astronomy and planetary science journals that have explicit editorial policies banning the publication of any papers dealing with Bode's law because it smacks of numerology. Now, at this point, I will point out that John Baines, one of the leading Egyptologists, well, it's related because the data found in regards to the presence of cocaine and tobacco in mummies, I'll pull that one. Give me a moment. I'll pull it up as an example. Give me a second. Okay, so it's often, like there are inbuilt prejudices for the alternative, let's call it, but it's also built into the system itself in so many fields. Now, for instance, this is in regard, so, cocaine or coca, tobacco, even a tobacco beetle was found in ancient Egyptian mummies, but this is the view. So the major reason for the initial criticism of Balabanova's work is a disbelief in pre-Columbian transoceanic contacts. Egyptologist John Baines in 1997 went so far as to say, the idea that Egyptians should have travelled to America is overall absurd, and I don't know anyone who spends time doing research in these areas because they are not perceived to be areas that have any real meaning for the subjects. Another interpretation of why researchers haven't considered the subject closer is given by Kehoe, 1998. After mid-century, any archaeologist worried about money or career avoided looking at pre-Columbian contacts across salt water. It appears that acknowledging that pre-Columbian contacts occurred was not academically acceptable. Kehoe also gives example of researchers whose work has been academically marginalized because it supported these views. So, for instance, Stephen Jett, Carl Johansson, Gordon Ekholm, Paul Tolstoy, and George Carter. They're not even shy about admitting the fact that there are certain subjects which are taboo. You cannot talk about them, doesn't matter what your data is. Now, Balabanova's work was backed up, cross-checked and found that it was actually the presence was found internally, not externally, but as an example of this certain mentality which is built in. So that's relevant because like literally any work, because it smacks of numerology, and I think that's a good way of now they're in the light of, like, it hasn't been debunked, it's just so against the perceived notion of what's acceptable academically speaking that anyone who even engages in this is immediately their career is up. They're going to lose they're going to lose funding, they're going to lose reputation, and all of this stuff. And this goes across so many fields. There are like contradictions and hypocrisies in regards to this, and so it's like the people who even consider the idea are risking their careers. And this is an important reference to Bode's law, because Bode's law and the harmony of the spheres as it connects to Pythagorean scales, music scales, and the quadrivium. However, again, it's just it's not to be discussed, not to be talked about. It's actually banned from being published in academia, which in itself is condemnation of their of their stance. I can't. I can understand it, because just as so many of us, of what's called the tinfoil hat conspirators get rusted onto a view, well, so has the academic world in so many ways. But just because because they have the argument from authority, and again, it's because I'm an authority, therefore I am the lawmaker. Yet it's an interesting aspect, and I think this carries on, and the excuses that they use to so-called debunk Bode's law is pretty weak. Now, for instance, in regards to Ceres, now Ceres being a protoplanet, therefore Ceres doesn't count. Well, Ceres is part of the asteroid belt, and that asteroid belt was either a planet which didn't form or a planet which was destroyed by some impact, possibly. No one's really sure. And in regards to Venus, now Venus slightly is outside of fitting into Bode's law, ever so slightly. However, Venus is the only planet which rotates in the opposite direction. And once again, the predominant theory in regards to that is that because Venus had some sort of impact, it doesn't fit the model that Venus would be the only planet who rotates in the opposite direction. And again, this does not include it in here. And when they talk about Neptune, again, it's not talked about the fact that Pluto and other bodies within the Kuiper belt pass closer to the Sun than what Neptune does, and I think that's a great disservice. And I think it also smacks of a prejudice, a preconceived notion. You know, nothing to see here, go away, it's all fake. Well, again, if you examine it, go through a little bit further, include all the details. By no means am I saying it confirms this, but at the very least it does confirm that there is a prejudice towards it, and that prejudice is not even paper thin at times. They literally, in the academic world, there's what's acceptable and there's what's not acceptable, and I don't care about your data, I only care about protecting the accepted paradigm. Okay, so back to the beginning, we have Pythagorean hammers and this particular theory and this idea of set scale, set ratios, which are so important to countless examples of architecture, older temples, ancient temples, to the, for instance, the great cathedrals, all embodied in this. Music, of course, being very important within those schools which were taught within these temples and these structures. And again, pure lovely symphony of coincidence, nothing to see here, go away. It described the same pattern, the same sets of very important numbers which are still with us today in screen resolution, etc. Goes back to ancient weights and measure scales. Just all happy coincidence, and that this happy coincidence, nothing to see here, go away, also not only described well, the known planets, it also predicted planets which were not known of. And as we saw in that little clip earlier, how certain schools within academia will not even allow it to be discussed or to be published. They're fundamentally resistant to even the notion of it. It's and just like other aspects in ancient history, are career killers. There are gatekeepers who will force this knowledge out. Now, just as a review, we begin with a circle. If you're familiar with your vesica geometry, how it develops into the circle, becomes the equilateral triangle, which becomes a hexagon, the 12-pointed star, 24, 48, etc. Venus, of course, does not fit the pattern. It's slightly out, but of course it revolves in the other direction, and which would should debunk then the accretion model. But yet that's not, they don't throw that out with the bathwater. And yet again, so not only does it show where Mars, Earth and Mars should go, it predicted the asteroid belt. And the excuse to deny that is to say, well, Ceres is too small to be a planet, although Ceres is just one of these bodies in this. So, and again, the asteroid belt, one of the description ideas is either there was a planet there and there was some sort of catastrophic collision, or that it did not develop fully. But still, it's if you were to grab all the bits and stick them together, you would have a planet. So that thing that Ceres is too small is in itself bunkum. Uranus was predicted and with accuracy, and the only other example which does not work within pure accuracy is Neptune. But of course Neptune is within the Kuiper belt, but Pluto in its closest pass to the Earth would be included in there. So again, I can't say 100% definitively, but you can see that there is a resistance to this type of stuff, and that a lot of times the so-called expert debunking is very selective in what they include and very selective in what they exclude, and that's not very scholarly at all. And so with that, hope you enjoyed this video. all his number, all his mind, all his consciousness. I think there's a lot to this. Again, it can be traced in architecture, it can be traced in music theory, and how this all connects as well to astronomy and based on geometry, because of course Bode's law, the zero, the circle to the triangle to the hexagon, etc. So cheers, have a good one.